Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
You know, guys, before we jump into anything, I have to say something that there's only 45% of people, only 45% of the people that watch this are subscribers. That means that 55% of you people watching this on YouTube are actually not even subscribed. What is going on?
Sad.
So click the subscribe button, guys. See, I usually throw this like never or later somewhere in the podcast, but I figure I better do it first now for those of you that listen and actually like, oh yeah, I should subscribe. The other thing is if you're a podcast listener, hey, give us a review. We haven't gotten any in a short amount of time, and a little bit, in a few, I don't know how long it is, but I want those to go up. I want more people to know that like there are people who love Tolkien who are reading the important parts, important things,
Also,
the best stuff.
Tell us one other person on the internet that's reviewing On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien, because I don't think there is one. I think we're the only ones.
Right now. I mean, I could find one in the past. I bet. But yes.
Well, that'd be interesting. Actually,
in a 5-episode part too. I mean, in a five-part episode. I totally jumbled that up. My goodness, man. All right. So yes, we are here. We're back on Fairy Stories. We had an interesting interview last week with Professor Nick Groom, the author of Tolkien in the 21st Century. We got some interesting feedback from you people about like we were a little too easy on him regarding the Rings of Power primarily. But I think we understood like he really comes from a different place. So we're going to talk about that in our extended podcast that you can get by becoming a member for $4 a month at theonering.com/member. The first month is free. So if you want to hear us talk about our thoughts about why we didn't push back hard on the Rings of Power and his thoughts on it. And hey, if you didn't listen to the extended podcast last week, what you'll find out is that his favorite character in all of Middle-earth was Tauriel from The Hobbit. So look, here's the thing. Like his position completely different than ours. Like his foundation of this completely different. And we knew that from the get-go. And I think that's okay. We still had a good conversation. And it wasn't predicated on the fact that we were going to be controversial or we were going to be we're going to push back on all the things we disagree with on. Right? It's more interesting, at least in the beginning, to find common ground and to talk about and to understand other people, and then you can have a different conversation. So that's even why we said at the end, where Michael brought up, like, hey, we should do a redux, like after the Rings of Power season 2, and see what we really think. Then we can come at it with a different perspective, and I think that would be a lot of fun. So anyway, we're going to talk about that more in our extended podcast.
Yeah. Basically, we did actually push back on a number of points, but we didn't do it in the usual internet ownage way. We were having a conversation with a man who wrote a book, and there's a thing called courtesy that we believe in. So.
Yeah, and a guy who really knows his Tolkien still, right? You may disagree with it, but he knew a lot, and he has he has reasons for the things he believes, and even though we certainly disagree with some of those reasons, he has them. So anyway, all right. So we'll talk about that.
How dare you guys? How dare you have a conversation with somebody you don't agree with?
This is why, Dan, you weren't a part of it, because we knew that you would bring the fire, and we had to really tone it down just a little bit of smoke, but not the hot heat flames that your overbearing extroverted personality brings in all of our. Yeah. Okay. We get that.
We get it.
Speaking of Dan's overbearing extroverted personality. Dan,
they're just silent.
Big thought.
My gosh!
I was handing off the baton there, trying to.
So, are you saying? Were you trying to say that in order to listen to the podcast, the extended podcast, you got to go to theonering.com/member, and in order to do that, we first have to go into
Dan's Big Thought.
All right, guys. So today we are finally on this part of On Fairy Stories, children. And Tolkien is answering the question, who are fairy stories written for? What is the audience of fairy stories? And then someone goes, Mr. Tolkien, is it children? And Tolkien goes, no. So one of the things that he brings up that's pretty interesting to me, he's saying children are just little humans. They're just like adults. They're like you and me. We're grown up. The only difference is that they're just not as mature. They don't have as much experience. They don't have as much understanding of certain topics, obviously. And so he's saying like fairy stories are not written for aliens. They're not written for like some other, abstract race. Like it's written for us. It's written for people. And one of the arguments that he uses, he starts talking about like why people have this understanding. Oh, fairy tales are written for children. And one of the arguments is like, well, they're more easily duped. They're more easily prone to just believe, like, oh, you told me that the dragon's real, so now I believe in the dragon, and that's why we have this conception that fairy stories are for children, because they're just more easily fooled. And I thought it was interesting that this is where he gets into subcreation, which I think was a really big part of this section of the essay, where he's saying that children aren't more likely to believe it's real in reality, but he's just talking about children are more. It's not about fooling them. It's more about that they just have a willingness to go along for the ride, almost like they're willing to do. I think he calls it literary belief, and he gets into this distinction between like sometimes like when you go into a movie and we're told, oh, you just have to suspend your disbelief to enjoy this movie. And he's saying, no, that's terrible. If you have to do that, it's a terrible movie. What you should be doing is subcreation, where it's another world that you can actually enter into that world, and the rules and the laws and the magic all make sense within that world. And he's saying, like, that's not a childish thing. That's everybody. Like, we're not supposed to suspend our disbelief. We're supposed to be looking for a story that can captivate our attention and actually make sense within the world that it's trying to convey.
Right. Yes, I love that part. I agree with you, Dan. I think that's the heart, is the talking about literary belief, where he dismisses suspension of disbelief as something. He doesn't dismiss it as a thing that can happen. He just says that's not what your goal is in fairy stories. It's almost as if people set up a binary where when you go into a tale that's a fiction, reading, movies, wherever it's being read to you, you're listening to it, whatever, the people kind of presume, well, you can either suspend disbelief, it's a well-written story, so you can suspend disbelief, or you can't suspend disbelief. So an example of that, like in the modern world, I'm watching She-Hulk. I cannot possibly suspend disbelief. I can't even. I'm watching the Barbie movie. I cannot suspend disbelief. It's so bad that my ability to pretend this is that I can be in this world for a moment, can't even do it. So I think what Tolkien said is basically there's three levels. There's that. If it's a bad story, you can't even suspend disbelief. Then there's the level you can suspend disbelief. In my mind, for example, if I watch the Predator movies, I can suspend disbelief. There's a lot of things about the Predator movies which make it unrealistic, like even within the story that it's being told. But there's enough of an element of sort of fun realism and grittiness, with the subject matter chosen, that I can suspend disbelief for a few hours and I can have fun watching the movie. And then there's what Tolkien says that you should be able to get to if the story's really told. And this is the real purpose of fairy stories, which is not suspension of disbelief, but actual literary belief, where the person who is hearing the story or in the story is actually in the story, that inside that world that you've created, subcreated, that the world is true. And as a literary world, not as like an LSD trip where you're on drugs and you're not sure what's real or what isn't. But and I'm saying that coming off of, like, there were in the 80s, for example, there were people that were very much against Tolkien because they lumped him in with the whole fantasy thing and the satanic panic stuff. And so this is not that. This is actually secondary belief. It's because it's from a world that's been subcreated. And that's kind of the highest level of fiction that Tolkien's saying. What I was curious was why you guys thought he started with children.
In the sense that, as opposed to adults, as opposed to saying this is for adults, rather than saying it's not just for children.
Right, because he says his purpose in the first sentence, second sentence is what, if any, first sentence, what, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? It actually reminded me of our author that we just interviewed. Tolkien was asking a similar question. He's saying, what is the value and function of fairy stories now, as in nowadays, when he's writing this essay, similar to Nick Groom, who's asking the question, what's the value of Tolkien in the 21st century now? So this was nearly 100 years before, obviously. So Tolkien's writing in a different. But why would the section be called children if that's his purpose, is to tell us what the value of fairy stories is now?
Well, clearly, I mean, he talks so much about Andrew Lang's books, the different colored books of fairy stories, and I think he had created the narrative that fairy stories are for children. And even Tolkien makes the point. I don't think I have it highlighted in my copy here, but he makes the point that he even took adult stories that weren't by the culture assumed they were for children and put them into these books, and then they became for children in a way. And so I think he felt like, and even then, the sentiment that, suspension of disbelief or a spell being put on you when you're reading a great story like this is something that children do. It's not something that mature adults do. And I think he was disabusing us of that notion. That's why he starts with children rather than starting with adults. Does that make sense?
I do. I think so. I see what he's doing as very actually philosophically in the same tradition as Aristotle. And when Aristotle or Plato, Socrates, when they want to discover what the essence of a thing is, they first start with what most people say a thing is. They'll say, okay, so what's the common opinion about what this is? And I see Tolkien starting that way, where he's taking the common opinion about fairy stories being that they're for children. And then, like Dan points out, his answer, as with every chapter, is no. Whatever you thought was right is wrong, and I'm going to show you how. So he goes through in a very, but he does it kind of haphazardly, to my mind. He doesn't do it he may start like Aristotle, but he doesn't follow through like Aristotle point by point. He kind of floats through his own experience as well of fairy stories when he was a kid. He talks about that experientially, in other words, and he says, Andrew Lang may say, for example, that this is one of the things he said was that children are easily fooled. That you touched on that, Dan. And his answer to that was, no, children want to know what's true. They're not just like sitting there looking for something to fool themselves, or in fact, they're very frequently not easily fooled. And then Andrew Lang, at another point, says that fairy stories, their taste, the taste of children, is what Andrew Lang is saying. The taste of children remains like the taste of their naked ancestors thousands of years ago, and they seem to like fairy stories better than history, poetry, geography, or arithmetic. And then Tolkien, that's the Andrew Lang quote. And then Tolkien goes on to debunk that in a very sort of Chestertonian fashion. He says, but do we really know much about these naked ancestors except that they were certainly not naked? So sort of Chestertonian starting with a paradox. Yeah. The one thing we know about our naked ancestors is that they weren't naked. And he goes on to say, essentially, we're presuming, that we're casting the likability of fairy stories into this far distant past, where children are sort of tapping into something from an uncivilized time. But Tolkien points out, hey, you know what our not naked ancestors liked as well? They liked history, geography, poetry, and arithmetic. So it's very likely instead that the love of fairy stories is based in something else, not just an overly primitive sense of children that children have. It's actually more human than that. And then he goes on to tell us what he thinks the actual root is, which is desire. That fairy stories awaken desire, and fairy stories are about desirability. And so, what is desirable, in other words? And then he goes on to talk about, for example, that was why he was never entertained by Alice, the Alice stories, or the Treasure Island, because he never liked pirates. Tolkien was not a pirate lover, but he did like, as he says, Red Indians. So the Native American stories, he liked those. Another quote that I think we've mentioned in the past. He liked Last of the Mohicans. When he was the story anyway. Who knows what he would have thought of the movie? But but then he says best of all is the Merlin and Arthur tales and the North, Sigurd and the Volsungs, and all of the tales of Anglo-Saxon North. So this is clearly what Tolkien finds desirable. So he's going to tell us a fairy story. I'm now extrapolating. He doesn't talk about this, but he's now going to tell us a fairy story about the things that Tolkien finds desirable, which is why you can actually have all kinds of fairy stories.
And one of the interesting things regarding the whole idea that it's for children that I found interesting is that when you leave things alone with children, generally they get ruined, right? So he talks about how if you leave a table in a nursery, it's going to be destroyed, right? If any one of these things would, if left altogether in the nursery, become gravely impaired, so would a beautiful table, a picture, a useful machine such as a microscope would be defaced or broken if it were left long unregarded in a schoolroom. And so it's, though children, they like adults, the same children who love fairy stories as children generally love them as adults. You grow up and you find, right, and he makes this point at the end too when he talks about, right, we're not meant to remain as a Peter Pan. You grow up and you start respecting and you start enjoying, you start finding the value in it rather than just the desire for it. And I think that was an important point that really short in here, but that's like, you don't leave children, because you know what, if you're left with a child's mind with arithmetic, it's never going to get bigger, better, grander, more believable, more sub-creative in that sense. Or am I reading too much into that?
No. I highlighted that sentence at the end of the one that you started quoting from. He says, "Fairy stories banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, would in the end be ruined. Indeed, insofar as they have been so banished, they have been ruined."
Yeah.
So he's saying it very clearly. The art of fairy stories is an adult art. It can be adapted to children, and he had just done so. In fact, when he was writing this essay, he had just adapted fairy stories to children with The Hobbit, because he had published The Hobbit, right, Jonathan? You're the date
1937.
guy. Yeah, so this is 30. There's two versions of this essay. One was 37, and the other one was 39. So this is the fuller version.
Let me go ahead, Dan.
He had an interesting comment regarding the timing of this coming after The Hobbit, where he's talking about how there seems to be we seem to be in an age of childhood sentiment where we're producing stuff for children specifically, as opposed to making it for everybody or making it as a grown-up. I think he uses the word adult art.
Yep.
And so what he's saying is, as a result, we're making a lot of bad stuff where stories are being adapted for children, and in the process they're being ruined in a sense. They're being sanitized, or they're being too simplified. And then he also says that these imitations are often merely silly and patronizing, or I got to be careful how I say this, covertly sniggering, as if like talking over the audience, like, I'm writing this for children, but you adults, you guys get what I'm saying. Like, these dumb kids don't get this part, but I'm gonna wink eyes and laugh with you adults out there. I thought that was interesting. I'm wondering if that line in particular, where he's talking about the covert sniggering, where you're talking over the audience, I wonder if that is a reflection of him thinking about writing The Hobbit. Because I'm wondering if, like, when he wrote The Hobbit, he made a choice to say, this is like my mythos adapted for children, and I wonder if he thought that maybe he made it too silly in the process.
Oh, interesting. Do you think that can you think of things in The Hobbit that you think that Tolkien was sort of laughing, that children would be caught up in, but that Tolkien was sort of laughing at what's going on in The Hobbit with the adults in the room, so to speak?
I'm trying to remember. I think that there's moments when he's introducing Bilbo in Bilbo's house where he's kind of like saying things in a matter-of-fact way to the adults, like, oh, of course this meant this. I can't think of the exact line, but he kind of describes hobbits in a very childlike way, and then he'll make like side comments.
Right. I think I suspect you're right. I'm trying to remember the same. I didn't know this was going to be one of your points, so it'd be fun to go back and look at The Hobbit in that light. But
something we touched on last week with Nick Groom, where he said, like, Tolkien kept revising The Hobbit because he wanted to bring it more into the adult fairy story of The Lord of the Rings rather than leaving it as this other story.
I think what we have to remember, based on what we were saying earlier in this conversation, is Tolkien didn't have a problem with fairy stories for children. He just said, if you leave it in the realm of just for children, if the only time fairy stories ever appear is as a child's tale, then you're going to have a real problem, and fairy stories are going to be ruined. But the idea of a fairy story appropriate to children, not a problem at all. I mean, you read his Father Christmas letters. That's all it is. It's children's fairy. It's a bunch of tiny fairy stories for children.
Let me ask a question then, and kind of bring this into some of the discussions regarding what people say today. So when what Tolkien's saying back then is that people say, oh, fairy stories, it's for kids. Is that similar in some ways, however, in a less patronizing way, in saying that now people say, like, we have to write it for modern audiences? Is there a parallel in treating something like that? Because both of them say, I have to do it in a certain vein. I have to cast certain lights onto this in order to make it appropriate for that group. Instead of saying, let's make it excellent, let's make it great. There are other things to hold true to rather than what the sensibilities of this group are. Yeah,
it's interesting. That's interesting. I would say that there is a similarity. It's not exactly the same, but what's happening is not exactly the same, but there's a very close similarity. Here's why. At the time when Tolkien says that, when he's talking about what fairy stories ought to be here, he says they were relegated to attics, basically. He says, I say perhaps, okay, at the least it will be plain that in my opinion, fairy stories should not be specially, he emphasized the word specially, associated with children. They are associated with them naturally because children are human, and fairy stories are a natural human taste, though not necessarily a universal one. Accidentally, in other words, they are accidentally associated with them because fairy stories are a large part of the literary lumber that in latter-day Europe has been stuffed away in attics, unnaturally, because of the erroneous sentiment about children, a sentiment that seems to increase with the decline in children. So Tolkien's getting at three causes that he says that fairy stories are associated with children: one correct, one accidental, and one incorrect. And so he's getting at the root of why Europeans and Americans associate fairy stories with children. Nowadays, the desire to remake an adult fairy story like Tolkien for a modern audience, I think, comes from a root where you look at the source. People are looking at the source, and this is a thing that happens all the time today, where people say, oh, but back in that day when that author wrote that book, they had these beliefs that I find reprehensible. So we have to, and the characters, they don't appear or talk the way the people on the streets of New York talk. So therefore, I have to rewrite their work as if it's not good enough in its own context. I have to rewrite it for a modern audience. So it's a very patronizing and very, it fails utterly to see wherein the value of old literature lies. In other words, that value, I would say, lies in the touching on timeless quality. So what makes great literature actually great, when it is great, is that it taps into universal truth and values that we all know. And people also nowadays mistake that. The values that they can feel a sync with values, like the fight for justice against injustice. They feel that. Modern audiences feel that, but they want it in the trappings of TikTok. They want it in the trappings of the cosmopolitan racial makeup of New York City. They want it in the trappings of what they are comfortable and familiar and hear it within, and they aren't willing to go outside themselves.
Is it also, when you say it's for modern audiences, in the same way that you make it for children, what you're doing is you're letting, and this is something Tolkien brought up in the previous chapters, is you're letting our world intrude on the secondary world, right? It makes it less. And so when you say, oh, you've got to make it for modern audiences, it is no longer a sub-created world. It's a siphon from this world into something else that they've created, that they've colored differently, but it's infiltrated with things that aren't appropriate to that. So for instance, like this is completely separate. I have watched Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is okay. One of the things that they said all of a sudden, and granted, we talked about whether Star Trek is fairy story or not, but you do have to have a believability, or you have to have a spell cast over you to believe this is happening in the Star Trek world, right? Any story, any good fiction story needs to do that. And so one of the things that the character said was, hold on to your butts. Do you guys know what that's originally from? You guys remember
No.
that quote? That's what,
yeah.
Dan, you remember this. You're like, what's it from? I know this. It's Samuel L. Jackson said it in Jurassic Park.
Yeah, you're right.
And I'm just like, wait, you can't make this, like, you can't reference our world in the secondary world. And it's like a microcosm of how writers that are on strike appropriately and should remain on strike are writing only what they know, and what they know are these stories from and they're not able to create great new fantasy worlds because they're not sub-creating. Actually, they're just riffing off of things that they've seen. It was horrible. It was horrible. Anyway, that's a complete
so
aside.
You're right that breaks the ability to have secondary belief. So or literary belief. Agree with that.
Yeah,
it's fascinating to me. I'm really I'm turning it over my head now. Like, what is it that they want to do? What are they trying to achieve? Because they're just destroying you can't have literary belief in a secondary world, in a sub-created world, if you keep referencing, because it yanks you out of that world and back into our own world. And for them, for the people that do this, the comfort that they find, I'm just making this up now, I'm just trying to think. It seems to me they find comfort in familiar references. So if a person says, hold on to your butts, they're like, I know that reference. And so it gives them a feeling,
I guess,
it's got to, like, why do they put in a line that only comes from the modern world? Because they don't care about whether a person in the story that they're telling would actually say that. They're just putting it in so that people can say, oh, I know that, as the meme goes.
Memberberry would
Captain
be
America meme. I understood that reference.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's that moment where you're like, yeah, I got a warm fuzzy because I know what you're talking about. It's the memberberry. Yeah.
Okay, back to children. Sorry about that. I pushed us into territories uncharted.
No. I at least we and we also brought up the covert sniggering, so that's fantastic.
One of the things,
I guess one of the things I was reading in the introduction on this version of On Fairy Stories, I think it's Verlin Flagger and Douglas Anderson. He has an introduction where he talks about the differences between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, just in terms of tone, in terms of the voice of the narrator. I guess like there's the example that he uses is when he introduces Bilbo, and it's Gandalf saying he's as fierce as a dragon in a pinch, and then the narrator will kind of like intrude in on that and make a joke about it, saying if you've ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you'll realize that this was only poetical exaggeration. So like the narrator jumps in to kind of make a joke about it. He also talked about
it almost sounds more like what you said, Michael, earlier. The Letters from Father Christmas, right? It's like Father Christmas narrating his own stories. It's almost like who the narrator is in parts of The Hobbit.
Yeah.
But that's what he was writing then.
And then there's the elves that are singing, and the narrator jumps in and says, "Oh, and they said other stuff that was just nonsense like that," like. so the narrator's constantly jumping in and kind of joking with the other clever people in the audience that are in on this being silly.
Yeah, you're talking about the Tralala elves.
Yeah,
in Rivendell.
Yeah. So
yes.
I don't know. I don't know if him thinking about On Fairy Stories. I'm probably jumping way off track here, but
no,
I don't think so.
I'm wondering if there's something between writing The Hobbit, giving this lecture on Andrew Lang and fairy stories, and then going on to write The Lord of the Rings. Like it seems like something kind of shifted for him, where maybe if he could go back in time, maybe he would rewrite The Hobbit and make it sound more similar in tone to what the rest of the mythos is.
Yeah, I think more it was that rather than an issue of it not being the fairy story that he wrote. Meaning, he wanted it to be a bigger part of the Lord of the Rings, right, and not an initial offshoot, and the tone wasn't right for it. And I think he knew that, but that doesn't mean he thought it was wrong for it originally. And if he hadn't written Lord of the Rings, it still would have been just fine. It would have been a fine fairy story in that sense.
So he's fine with adapting things for children so that they can come in, like I'm trying to think of an example. But it wasn't
Yeah, I mean, though the Hobbit was not an adaptation, it was simply the way it was written.
Right. Yeah, I guess that'd be like saying if he wrote the Lord of the Rings children adapted version. Like I wonder if he would be against that completely, or if he would understand where that's coming from and just say, well, you're probably going to be leaving lots of good stuff out, but maybe that's still okay. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Would he be okay? I would suspect he would not be okay with Lord of the Rings being adapted for children. The reason is, I think the Lord of the Rings was written as an adult fairy tale. So would it be? I mean, I don't know that he'd have a big problem with it, but it would not be the same story. Like his point,
Yeah.
I feel like this is my own projection. I grant first off, but I feel like chronologically coming where this essay does, where he had written The Hobbit, he had published The Hobbit, and he was getting commentary about The Hobbit, and this was in fact one of the reasons why he wrote the essay was as a defense of this kind of writing. It wasn't just the issue of writing a fairy tale; it was the issue of writing fiction at all for a learned and lauded professor of Anglo-Saxon literature like himself from his Oxford fellows. And so he was writing in defense of the idea of fictional literature in general.
Mm-hmm.
I see this as a transition. Like right now, as he's writing this in the late 1930s, he's also trying to bring The Hobbit in line. He is realizing that he wants to bring The Hobbit in line with his secondary world rather, that he's been developing for the last 20 years and 20 some years. And he's starting to make those shifts and writing Lord of the Rings and fitting it all together, and he'll continue to do that for many years to come after this. But there's a real sense, I think, and you see this at the end of this essay, there's a real sense that there's a lack of real fairy stories in the world, that we've kind of relegated fairy stories to the nursery inappropriately. And so I see his Lord of the Rings as an example of, he even brings it up, the fact that he actually didn't come to a love of fairy stories until he was older. He says, all the same, important as I now perceive the fairy story element in early reading to have been, in other words, when he was a child. Speaking for myself as a child, I can only say that a liking for fairy stories was not a dominant characteristic of early taste. A real taste for them awoke after nursery days and after the years, few but long seen, between learning to read and going to school. Okay. In that time, I liked many other things as well, or better, such as history, astronomy, botany, grammar, and etymology. So he's saying, though, in that intervening time, he had other loves, and then he grew to love fairy stories after that. I mean, we see that because, of course, as he's graduating from college, as he's going off to World War I, he's writing fairy stories, or the beginnings of fairy stories. So he came to the love of fairy stories later as he's growing up, not just when he's a little child, and then putting away that love. Although he does admit that it's a taste. The taste for fairy stories is not a universal taste. There are plenty of people that just don't like it, and he doesn't have a problem with that.
Well, and he had a taste for it, and as he grew and as he matured and as he learned more, it almost like that was the soil that his taste for it started growing in deeper and deeper until it's finally flowered, right? So if it wasn't for an interest in history, astronomy, botany, grammar, and etymology, the fairy story that he created, the sub-creation, would have been far less grand, right? It would have been nothing. It wouldn't have existed even.
Yeah, he wouldn't have been able to write an adult fairy story.
Yeah, and even I like his little line. He's like, I was, for instance, insensitive to poetry and skipped it if it came in tales. And all of us were like, yes, we did that the first time too when we read The Lord of the Rings. We're like,
we skipped all your poetry
but then
when I read it at 8 years old.
He discovered it much later in Latin and Greek. And that when he discovered it much later, he's like, oh, there's value to this. I'm going to actually start incorporating this here, and I'm going to start using this and trying it out. And in the same way, we can now go through The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and read that. We have a greater appreciation for it, I think, the more that you read into Tolkien, the more that you actually enjoy his works, right? It sort of grows rather than is something you end up skipping over all the time.
Yep. Now, to be fair, he does in this section delve into something where he gives Andrew Lang his due about children, because there is something about the land of fairy, which he says you have, in order to appreciate fairy, you have to have the heart of a child. He says, I do not deny that there is a truth in Andrew Lang's words, sentimental though they may sound. Quote, he who would enter into the kingdom of fairy should have the heart of a little child, close quote. For that possession is necessary to all high adventure, into kingdoms both less and far greater than fairy. So in other words, he's referencing scripture, obviously, when Christ is saying that you have to have you have to be like a child and come to him. And he's, in other words, that's the kingdom far greater than fairy, is the kingdom of heaven. So there's a real but there's a real sense in which you have to, and then in this case he quotes Chesterton, one of my favorite quotes about Chesterton and fairy stories. He says, Chesterton once remarked that the children in whose company he saw Maeterlinck's, is it Maeterlinck's or Lynx? Maeterlinck's blue bird, I have never seen it, so I don't know what it is, were dissatisfied because, quote, because it did not end with a day of judgment, and it was not revealed to the hero and the heroine that the dog had been faithful and the cat faithless. For children, he says, this is Chesterton, are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy.
I love that.
Which is, and then he says Andrew Lang was confused on this point. In other words, what he's saying is you do have to be like a child. You have to have humility and innocence to answer Land of Fairy, but it's not an uncritical wonder or an uncritical tenderness. It is not the immature emotions of the child that you have to have, but rather the openness to wonder and to these real and sometimes very sharp truths like justice, like a love for justice. And so that's it's fascinating. But so there is a sense, I'm just pointing out, there is a sense in which there are childlike qualities required for the full appreciation of fairy. But as Tolkien says, there are also childlike qualities required for a kingdom far greater than fairy. So those childlike qualities are not just relegated to the land of fairy. They're qualities that we should have in general. We should be leaning into that kind of humility and innocence and love of wonder without being childish in the way that we look at things.
Yeah, and that the one big thing I took out of this, my big thought, Dan, was that believability is not the primary function in children of fairy stories. It's desirability. It's what they desire, right? He says, I desired to shoot. I can't remember. I have an unrequited desire to shoot well with an arrow, with a bow. And then he also, I desired dragons with a profound desire, right? So that it's not whether it's believable or not, it's how desirable it is and the world that we want to inhabit. And so that's why in these worlds like Middle Earth that Tolkien created, we want to inhabit it. We desire to be there, whether it's believable, whether we are able to suspend disbelief. I don't like that term, suspend disbelief, in this sense either, because we don't really suspend our disbelief in things. We simply desire it greater than anything else immediately around us, right? And that's why we enjoy it so much, and that's why we can fall into it. And children have a greater ability to desire these things. It is easier for them to fall into that desirability, not believability, because they know when they pretend that they're not really cops or robbers, they're not really spacemen and aliens, right? They know that, but they desire it, and so they're able to fall into that and enjoy it in a way that and even respect it in a way, right? Because it's real to them, right? They're subcreating in this imagination of theirs right now. The spell is cast on them, and I thought that for me was my big takeaway from reading this part of the essay.
Yeah, and he almost seems to be defining fairy stories a little bit more for us too, because in that section he says it's not just desire for adventure, it's not just desire for treasure. It's desire for, I think he uses otherworld as a noun. It's otherworld. And I think he even gives you some inclinations that it's going back to other parts of the essay where it's something ancient, it's something old, it's something foreign. And then that made me think of dragons and maps and, it's like a whole nother world with its own history. That seems to be what he's getting at.
Yeah.
Right, and that's why, because we're not allowed to finish an episode without referencing Rings of Power, apparently.
No, we're not.
So his quote, nothing to do with Rings of Power, that he luckily didn't know was going to exist less than 100 years after he wrote this. But the land of Merlin and Arthur was better than these. This is the treasure, better than the Treasure Island, better than the stories of Indians, of Native Americans. He says, and best of all, the nameless north of Sigurd and the Volsungs and the prince of all dragons. Such lands were preeminently desirable. So he's desiring a whole land there. And Tolkien is telling us plainly, and of course everyone that knows his work knows that this is exactly what he did with Lord of the Rings. He wrote a fairy story about the nameless north. It was a Northern European fairy story. So if you're going to adapt a Northern European fairy story, then you should do so with that as your current. That is the movement of the water that you are adapting. So if you're going to accurately, for example, tell a story of the Second Age of Middle Earth, then you need to do so by retelling a story with Tolkien's broad strokes, but where the details are indeed a Northern European fairy story. And that's why the Rings of Power and all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff that got mixed in with it was, whatever you think of the diversity, equity, and inclusion principles, it was at the very least wholly inappropriate for Tolkien, because was not just as if you were to write if you were going to write a fairy story in the Age of Gilgamesh. But you decided to do that by doing only South American peoples or peoples of the Americas. That would be wholly inappropriate, because it does not have the character of the peoples of the Middle East and Northern Africa, which is what the Lay of Gilgamesh takes place. And so this is this is his fairy story being told. But there's room for fairy stories of all types. And if you can tell a good story and create a good story of any type, maybe you are a person that loves pirates, so you can tell a fairy story about a pirate world, or a world in which there's a pirate adventure, and that could be totally a real fairy story in Tolkien's mind.
Anytime the modern world intrudes on this, it's a failure. It just never works.
But it doesn't have to be, Jonathan. It doesn't have to be. They could have that's what kills me. What kills me is, I don't have any faith in the modernity, because modernity has failed us in 18 ways from Sunday. But when modernity is about to do something like the Rings of Power, I always think in the back of my head of what it could be. And I think if you approach it with the right spirit, and you're trying to write the type of fairy story that Tolkien was trying to write, because you are using his world, then it could be beautiful. It could be wonderful.
The shallow idea that it has to be representative is silly. This bit of news I think came out recently. There's a new Assassin's Creed game. I think it's for phones or whatever. It's set in Japan at hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And who's the primary protagonist? Apparently, it's an African samurai and a female ninja. Neither that don't
exist.
Yeah. So even in the simple little things of our time, they just, like, when you start off with less believable, less desirable like that, you're like, well, I want to be in that world. If you pull me out of that world, you're making these characters, and I'm just not there, because that never would have happened.
So there is, funnily enough, there is one way it could happen. Have you ever read the book Shogun?
Mm-mm.
James Clavell. So it's this old, story about fish out of water story about it. It's like The Last Samurai. It's about a European that finds himself. So if you tell it as a fish out of water story, where for some believable reason somebody from another ethnic culture, it finds himself in Japan, and with all of the problems that comes with someone, and all of the struggles and friction that creates, then write that story. Okay, fine. But if you're just going to say, you can pretend that everyone from Japan is going to not look twice at an African samurai, then you're an idiot. because that's not what you're writing isn't believable.
Or a traveling band of hobbits that have been traveling together for 1,000 years and somehow all completely look like they were from different corners of the world. It just makes no sense. All right, guys.
So he finishes.
Right.
So he finishes with a transition to our next chapter on fantasy, because he says, "Very well then, if adults are to read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, neither playing at being children, nor pretending to be choosing for children, nor being boys who would not grow up, what are the values and functions of this kind?" That is, this kind of literature, this branch of literature. So what are the values of fairy stories? That is, I think, the last and most important question. I've already hinted at some of my answers. First of all, if written with art, the primary value of fairy stories will simply be that value which, as literature, they share with other literary forms. But fairy stories offer also, in a peculiar degree or mode, these things. So these 4 other things: fantasy, recovery, escape, consolation. All things which children have, as a rule, less need than older people. So what he's saying is actually, we need to write more adult fairy stories because we need fairy stories more than kids do.
Yeah.
Most of them are nowadays very commonly considered to be bad for anybody. I will consider them briefly, and we'll begin with fantasy. So,
and that's what we're going to do next week.
We're finally do the elements. Are we going to just do fantasy?
Just do fantasy.
How long is it?
It's long enough because we always talk long enough to make it a full episode. It's going to be just fantasy.
One of these days, Jonathan will have an episode where we only spend 35 minutes.
We already did that. It was like 1 year and 3 months ago.
You just turned the camera on for 30 minutes and talked to yourself.
There you go. Yeah.
It almost sounds like towards the end where he's talking about fantasy, recovery, escape, consolation. That's what the value of fairy stories are. And then
peculiar value.
He has to like defend those things. Now, it's almost like, nowadays, like when I was growing up, defending to your parents why video games are okay. Like that would be like a modern modern debate. Like how dare you be in a fantasy world? How dare you escape?
That was you were going to write that essay on video games, weren't you?
So fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation will be interesting to dig into what he means. But I agree with you, Jonathan, with Dan. Most of them, quote, most of them are nowadays very commonly considered to be bad for anybody. So, yep, video games, bad for anybody.
Depends on the game, like that new Assassin's Creed game.
Gollum is, I can tell you that.
Gollum. Hey, just real fast, that whole company is no longer in service.
I know.
No longer around.
That was the fastest fastest implosion of a company I've ever seen. Like you put out a game, and it's 3 months later. I think it's 3 months.
Not even. It was like
They're
a
gone.
month ago. They're gone. It was like 2 months after
As
that.
if they never existed.
Well, they're just repurposing other people's video games. They're just republishing them or something like that, or throwing them.
So they're not going to patch that game like they promised.
Well, they did. They patched it, and this person, I read an article where this guy who is a reviewer, he had, I think it was the next day or the day after, 2 days later, there had been a total of 7 downloads of the patch. 7.
I haven't. Yeah, that's.
This is an article I read yesterday. It was awesome.
That's amazing. Those 7 people are like, I really want this Golem game. I really want it to work.
How many of those were the developers or the beta
Oh my
testers?
gosh! Yeah, nobody would go back, and nobody wants to go back and actually. I have not booted it up since I did the live stream. There's
no desire to. It's trash.
Yeah. I can't love it at all. All right, guys. Well, next week we'll do fantasy. However, this week we do have this.
If you like Tolkien.
And I read The Lord of the Rings on my dad's copy of The Lord of the Rings, which was this old 1960s version. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to go ahead. And I bought, that color is bad. I bought these 3 original copies that are pretty good.
I remember those. Those were the library copies in my middle school.
They're so funky. I mean, those copies, like the drawings, and they kind of, I think they all come together. Oh shoot, I just dropped it. Anyway, it was eBay.
The originals, right? Is that the first edition?
No, I'll tell you what they are. But yeah, they come together. They create like one picture. You can see that.
Oh,
they create one picture. These here were published. Let's see. This copy was published in. This is for Judy. I got it on eBay. A couple of pages are falling out. I think I only paid like $15 for all three of these here, so you can find some good deals. A lot of times they'll go for more. The Return of the King, the two towers are actually in really good condition. There's almost nothing. The Fellowship of the Ring was read a little bit more. Somebody didn't finish it. Maybe the cover's falling off. This here was published. Hold on. I'm trying to get there without breaking another page out. This is the sixth printing, August 1966.
Okay.
The first printing, wow. So they had 6 printings between October 66 and October 65 and August 1966. But this was the first U.S. printing in 65. Apparently.
So this is at the heyday of the sort of the height of popularity of Tolkien.
So that right there. Sorry, I should go back to like all three of us here. Sorry about that. There we go. That one right there. Yeah.
That's cool.
So anyway, that was kind of a fun thing. So you can find like good deals sometimes. I've been looking for one that was these three that were relatively inexpensive on eBay, and so I decided to bite the bullet and got them. Really, just like they smell like the books when I read them. Even like they were old, and when I read them in 1987, 88, they were like 20 years old then, and now they're like 50 years old. I mean, 40 years old. That.
No. What are you talking about? 1966, they're 60 years old or 55.
Arithmetic is for children. I don't really worry about that, right? It's relegated to the nursery room. I don't think about that much anymore.
Right.
All right, everybody. We're going to go to our extended podcast where we're going to talk about a little bit more about the interview last week and why we conducted it the way we did and some of our thoughts about that. And if you want to hear that, you can go ahead to thewarning.com/member, become a member, listen to it for free, and then pay the next month if you want to for $4. Or you can become a sponsor like Harrison, Adam, Lynn, and Chuck, who chip in some more and support us even more to pay for the big bills. We've got the big StreamYard bill coming up in November, I think, the yearly one. Anyway, but no, guys, we appreciate all the support that you give us, and it's a pleasure to have you along. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk about the question I has about. Gosh, got to get it up here.
TikTok.
What he thought about tragedy, a little bit. What Tolkien might have thought about tragedy. So we're gonna bring that up, and we're gonna jump into our supporter section, our sponsor section, our member section. Please join us there.
And goodbye, freeloaders.
Yes, thank you. Just making sure that we have that in there.